You was a singular artist. I mean, you
Was
know,
he crazy or
the
was he
greats
ill?
usually are.
Is there
I
a
guess
difference?
they
They
have
didn't
their own style
understand
that's
the passion and
definitive.
commitment
But at the
of an
time,
artist.
they didn't look like anything that had been painted before. They wanted pleasant subjects,
Ces sensations et cette humanité.
In fact, Vincent was not that very poor in a sense. He had a brother to support, and he got more money for
He was a preacher, he was a baker, he was all kinds of things until he really realized that he wanted to be an artist.
People were a bit afraid of him.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your call to places for the beginning of Act 1. Places, please, ladies and gentlemen. Act 1 will begin in 3 minutes.
Hello, I'm Leonard Nimoy. For a number of years, I've been researching the life and the work of artist Vincent Van Gogh. It's been a gratifying and at times a highly emotional experience. Vincent was an artistic genius, yet he received no recognition during his lifetime. His work was dismissed as that of a madman. He expressed these frustrations in over 500 soul-searching letters to his brother Theo, the one person who loved him and who tried to understand him. At age 37, Vincent died in Theo's arms. Theo was so overcome with grief that he was unable to speak at his brother's funeral. The setting for our play tonight is a lecture hall in Paris. The time is late July 1890, about a week after Vincent's death. Theo has rented the hall, and he's invited artists, friends, anyone who will listen to him. His hope is that tonight he'll be able to express himself and to do justice to the memory and the reputation of his beloved brother, Vincent.
Vincent is a play that I wrote many years ago, and I performed it many times all across the United States. I was drawn to it because, for one thing, it was a one-person show, which I was looking for. I wanted the challenge of being on stage alone to do this piece, but more important because of the subject matter. It's about Vincent Van Gogh, the great painter, and the character on stage that I portrayed is named Theo. It's his brother, Vincent's brother, who supported Vincent for the 10 years that Vincent was painting until Vincent died.
Well, Leonard was looking towards years of being in the theater. And after a while, he said what he wanted to do was discover a piece that he could develop into a one-man play. Someone suggested he read the letters between Theo and Vincent. And he did, and on the basis of the profundity of those letters, he decided he would develop a play about the relationship between the brothers.
So this play that I wrote takes place a week after Vincent's death, and it is Theo who has called together these people, this audience, to ask them to give him a second chance to talk about his brother, who he loved so much.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for this second opportunity. I'll do my best to tell you some things about my brother, Vincent.
In this particular case, it's being done by a very good actor named Jean-Michel Richaud. He's a wonderful actor, very serious about what he does, and does a beautiful job with his play. Makes me very proud to be sitting in the audience watching him do it.
Well, it all started with my wife. She gave me the letters between the two brothers. I read the entire book in a few days. It moved me like I've never been moved by any books. And I was shell-shocked when I read it, and I said, I need to do something about this. Already at the time, I just wanted to do it in French, maybe. So I contacted Leonard Nimoy, and he said, yeah, go ahead, do it in French. I said, by the way, I'm having the premiere in a couple months, and you're welcome to come. I never thought he would say yes, and he came to the premiere with his wife.
We had seen 2 other productions which were very mediocre. And I said, of course. So we went and saw it, and it was a revelation. Jean-Michel was a revelation. He discovered the play in a very unique and powerful way, very different from Leonard's portrayal.
He was very kind. They gave us a Q&A at the end, and he had very kind words for performance, and then ever since he was close with the production and helped me finding new venues, and we became, you know, close through the play.
Well, Vincent Van Gogh, or Van Gogh as we say in Dutch, was born in 1853 in a very small town called Zundert, the south of the Netherlands, very close to the Belgian border. His father was a minister of the Protestant church.
His father was a preacher, but he didn't get a big church. He was sent down to this tiny village in the south of Holland.
After Vincent, some other siblings were born. He had a brother, Theo, who became very important to him towards the end, more later in his life. He had 3 sisters, and there was in the end a younger brother.
He was named Vincent not only after his grandfather, but also after an older brother who had died just a year before our Vincent Van Gogh was born.
My brother Vincent was born twice. The first time, he was conceived in joy. He was born on March 30th, 1852, but he was stillborn. He was named Vincent, and he was buried in the graveyard at Father's Church.
La deuxième fois, il a été conçu dans la tristesse. Et à exactement la même date, un an plus tard, jour pour jour, le 30 mars 1853, mère donna naissance à nouveau. Et il a été appelé Vincent.
And every Sunday, when we went to hear Father preach in that chapel in Zundert, Vincent saw that tombstone that bore his own name. So, you make of it what you will. He was born twice.
Vincent Willem Van Gogh on the tombstone, his own name. That must have affected him so deeply.
And Vincent was a very difficult child. He was a huge disappointment from an early age. And all of a sudden, after the birth of a daughter, another son is born, Theo, and he's the opposite. He's better looking, he's cheerful, he's well-disciplined, he helps out around the house, he does well in school. So the family preferred Theo.
Well, when you were part of the Van Gogh family, you either became a clergyman or you went into the art trade business. It's simply said, you went to a gallery. His father was a minister, so he was a vicar. Some of the uncles were working as, had an art gallery, working for an art gallery. And it was with one of those art galleries that Vincent started working when he was 16 years old in The Hague.
When he left the art business, he thought that ministering to the needs of a congregation would be emotionally more satisfying than being an art dealer, and he threw himself into it as he did into every endeavor.
You see, that was his first great passion. He wanted to follow in the footsteps of our father and grandfather, to be a minister, to preach. For 2.5 years, his letters were full of God and the gospel. Dear Theo, no day passes without praying to God and without speaking about him. May God grant me the wisdom which I need and give me what I so fervently desire. Dear Theo, I've applied for a position as evangelist among the miners in the coal mines. In Belgium, in the south, there's a district called the Borinage, with a population of laborers who work in the mines. I should like very much to go there as an evangelist, preaching the gospel to the poor. Light that rises in the darkness, says the gospel. Who will need this most? Who will have ears for it? Those who walk in darkness in the center of the earth.
Alors, lorsqu'il arrive au Borinage, il arrive en tant que prédicateur. Donc, il loue une chambre, dans un premier temps à Wam, chez Jean-Baptiste Denis, qui est un agriculteur. Dans un premier temps, Van Gogh touche un salaire. pour pouvoir vivre, pour pouvoir payer la location de sa chambre. Van Gogh a l'occasion aussi d'aller visiter des mines, et notamment la mine de Marcasse, où il descend à plus de 700 mètres de profondeur. Il est accompagné évidemment d'un mineur qui a plus de 30 ans de carrière. Il ne descend pas seul dans les mines. Et là, il est vraiment confronté aux conditions de travail de ces personnes. Ça le marque profondément. Il voit travailler des enfants, il voit travailler des femmes, des hommes couchés qui travaillent plus de 12 heures par jour sans voir la lumière du jour. C'est quelque chose qui le marque profondément.
In that time, you might say, his mind always shifted a little bit in the sense that what he, of course, encountered there was absolute poverty. Poverty-stricken people with very hard lives. And although he kept preaching the faith as he was allowed to, he also mingled with the people, tried to help them, gave them his clothes, tried to live as poorly as they did.
Dear Teo, I write to you from the Bornage. There have been many cases of typhoid and fever. Most of the miners are thin, pale, tired, emaciated, weather-beaten, aged before their time.
En règle générale, leurs femmes sont elles aussi blêmes et fanées. Autour du charbonnage, de misérables cahutes de mineurs et quelques arbres morts noircis par la fumée, des haies de ronces, des tas de saleté et de cendres, et des montagnes de charbon inutilisables.
He had this sense of that at the countryside everything is more primitive, but it's closer to God. It's in a sense it's closer to the real life.
He wanted to stay there. He wanted a permanent appointment in that misery, to spend his life in that hole, because he was at home with those people, with the poor, the peasants, with the outcasts. With them, he felt at home.
His father came over, and Vincent must have been trying to explain what he was doing there, and they said, well, it's better. At that moment, he was living in a shed outside of the house.
See, he actually believed one must be poor to preach to the poor. So he gave away all his possessions, covered his face with soot, lived on bread and coffee. He gave away his bed. He slept on a straw mat on the floor of a hut.
He didn't know how to talk to people. So he would get up in this town hall and he would get into a frenzy.
I am a stranger on the earth. Hide not thy commandments from me. There is an old belief, and it is a good belief, that our life is a pilgrim's progress and that we are strangers on the earth.
Notre vie est une longue marche, un long voyage de la terre au ciel. Ons leven is lange reis van de aarde naar de hemel. Nous avons un combat à mener.
The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, the Father, the fellowship of the Holy Ghost be with us forevermore. Amen.
So between speaking too fast, talking in abstractions that weren't really coherent, in a French that was not really easy to understand, they thought he was crazy, as many people did.
It was too much. Too much for the church authorities, you see. He wasn't exactly their ideal image of a proper servant of God. So they forced him to give it up. They forced him out of the job, and he was lost. Lost. He was cut off from everything he believed in. He was lost. Dear Teo, you say, quote, only a few witnesses would have to declare me unfit to manage my own affairs. This would be sufficient to entitle father to take away my civil rights and put me under guardianship, end quote. I take the liberty to doubt it. If you ask me, I don't think the family would try a thing like that. Yes, father's capable of it, but I shall fight him to the limit. Let him think twice before he attacks me.
Vincent's relationship with his parents, his relationship with his father particularly was very, very bad, very bad. And there's some belief that he signed all his paintings Vincent because he didn't want to use the father's name, Van Gogh. Didn't want people to know that he was a Van Gogh. Didn't want his father to be honored by his work.
Every meeting between Vincent and father ended in nothing but pain, terrible arguments. Father always finding fault, Vincent always more and more stubborn, difficult. So, I was a negotiator.
Et vous comprenez aussi que j'étais celui qui devait traiter avec nos parents. Ça ne pouvait pas, c'était impossible.
And from this moment on, for a year, he didn't correspond, almost a year, he didn't correspond with Theo. Because when that moment arrived in the Borinage, many people came in to chip in with some advice, say, why don't you become a baker? Why don't you try this or that? And they thought he was just living off his family, and he should find a proper job.
He wrote to me from Brussels a year later, October 1880. Dear Theo, if I had stayed a month longer in the Belgian Black Country, I should have been sick with misery.
et ma santé n'a pas été par trop bonne dernièrement. Mais si seulement je pouvais apprendre un jour à bien dessiner. Et voilà enfin. Maintenant il savait. Maintenant Vincent savait que le bourrinage n'était pas une fin, mais un commencement. Sa passion l'avait amené chez les mineurs, et là il a commencé à voir. Il a commencé à dessiner.
And at that point, his brother suggested, well, you're so much with your hand in the land of paintings, as you write in your letters, why don't you become an artist then? He knew that he had to draw for the first couple of years if he wanted to train his hand and to become a proper artist.
Vincent struggled to find himself for the first 20 some odd years of his life. He was a preacher, he was a baker, he was all kinds of things until he really realized that he wanted to be an artist.
So he enlisted in the academy in Antwerp in 1886 to try his hand again at drawing after sculpture. And he also tried to enlist himself in the painters class in Antwerp.
I want my paintings and my subjects to live, not to satisfy the academicians, not to be academically correct, but to live. I must learn to paint what I feel. Not what I see, but what I feel about what I see. Now, I adore the figures by Michelangelo, though the legs are too long and the back sides are too large. I want to learn to make these very incorrectnesses, these deviations, remodelings, changes in reality, so that they may become lies, if you like, but truer than the literal truth. Theo, I'm finished at the Antwerp Academy, Theo. I'm finished. It's a rigid, formal institution, dead, bound by tradition. Not a place for an impressionist to flourish. My ideas drove the instructors quite mad. They treated me as if I was spreading some kind of disease.
La semaine dernière, on devait dessiner un moulage de la Vénus de Milo. J'étais tellement frappé par la puissance de cette silhouette que j'ai accentué les hanches. L'instructeur était un puriste. Il a saccagé mon dessin. Il l'a saccagé avec son crayon. Je me suis levé de ma chaise et je lui ai dit « Vous ne savez donc pas ce qu'est une femme ?»
A woman must have hips and buttocks and a pelvis in which she can hold a child. And that was the last lesson I ever took at the Antwerp Academy.
Vincent, because he was not incapable of discipline, simply couldn't put himself through the systemic effort to achieve that craft and that skill set. So he never really could draw the human form accurately, but what he did was to redefine what it meant to depict reality so that the depiction was measured not by its accuracy, but by its emotional and pictorial power.
We come to know Vincent as the master impressionist painter who painted very colorful flowers and intense paintings of people and so forth. But the thing that impressed me was his mastery of draftsmanship, which you see in some of the drawings that we have in this show. Some of the drawings that I came across, you would never guess were done by Vincent Van Gogh. There are landscape, actual pen and ink drawings that are extraordinarily beautiful and masterful in their execution. And he wrote often to Theo about the fact that he was struggling to learn to draw, to get perspective correct, to be able to depict a given situation that he saw, to depict it accurately. Then he moved into Impressionism, where he began, as he said, to paint what he felt about what he saw.
Théo, Père m'a confié que tu m'envoies de l'argent depuis longtemps, à mon insu. Je t'en remercie cordialement. Je me plais à espérer que tu n'auras jamais à le regretter.
The parents sent some money. They just didn't have much money to send. So early on, to take the burden off of their shoulders, Theo took it on himself, and he gave him at one point a third of all of his income.
He just begged money throughout his life to his brother, and that must have been such a burden to Theo, who wanted to help out, but sometimes just couldn't.
He didn't have enough money to pay professional models, so he found poor people. And among the people he found were prostitutes. And among those prostitutes was Sien Hornig.
Theo, I write from The Hague. I'm staying in a little inn. I've found a woman, not young, not beautiful, rather tall and strongly built, and life has been hard for her. She's not distinguished, nothing extraordinary, nothing unusual. Theo. To me, there is such a wonderful charm in that slight fadedness, that something over which life has passed. It is not the first time that I have been unable to resist that feeling of affection and love. This woman has been very good to me. Very good.
Is it clear? She was a woman of the streets.
Le nouveau grand amour de mon frère était une femme de la rue.
Everyone who met her, including me, was appalled by her. She had a nasty tongue, vicious temper, she drank, and she smoked cigars. Why? Why, Vincent? Why?
Vous comprenez bien sûr que j'étais en charge non seulement de mon artiste de frère, mais de cette femme et de son enfant, et de son futur enfant, et même de sa mère.
How do you present this kind of news to your parents? To a minister and his wife?
Père, j'ai des nouvelles de Vincent. Eh bien, il semble qu'il ait trouvé une femme.
No, Father, I don't think it's very likely that you would know her.
Oui, mère, je l'ai rencontrée. Comment est-elle?
I would say she's interesting, very interesting. No, Father, she's not employed. Vincent tells me she's given up her career. By the way, there's a child, and she's expecting another. No, not by Vincent, no. Well, we don't seem to know exactly who the father is.
That was in a period, you might say, that Vincent was especially trying to take care of these women. He had an idea of that these kind of women had to be helped. They were not social outcasts. He wanted to do something for them, help them in a more moral way.
It says something about his art that he transformed this very awkward situation where he's living with this prostitute that he's paying by the day. In his mind, this was a happy family.
Une pauvre femme déchue, il a sauvé de la rue elle et ses enfants. Il voulait l'épouser.
It was his greatest wish to, in the end, to have a proper life, what he called the real life, to have a wife and children.
Father said we'll take legal action. We'll have him declared unfit to manage his own affairs. We'll have him put into an asylum.
Alors, pour le bien de la famille, je lui ai finalement déclaré demander de la quitter.
He wanted to be liked. I mean, he desperately wanted emotional connection with other people, and the failure of that connection was just a source of constant suffering for him.
He couldn't be alone. He could not be alone. He had to live for somebody. The fact is, his work was getting better.
He left the academy quite suddenly, also probably because he had some debts in Antwerp which he couldn't pay, and more or less fled to Paris.
Durant le spectacle, j'ai une centaine de tableaux de Van Gogh qui sont projetés. Et en général, on les projette sur un grand écran qui est sur le côté ici. C'est un écran encadré, donc tu as l'impression que c'est sur un tableau.
I had a lot of recommendations from all around from different producers and friends, actor friends, to go to such and such theater. But I always had this one in mind because it's in Montmartre. It's about 2 blocks from where Theo and Vincent used to live. Literally, it's behind the Moulin de la Galette. It's the perfect place. In the entire world, this theater is the perfect place.
When you're doing a one-man show, it's a lonely project. It's a lonely project. When you're out there alone for the entire process, there's never a moment where you can give up your focus and your dedication to the work. You're on all the time, every moment.
Leonard's acting career was affected, obviously, both negatively, one could say, and positively by playing Spock. He was so identified with this character that it was hard initially for him to get cast in other parts after Star Trek, the series, ended.
I became known as Leonard Nimoy, he of the pointed ears. You know. He who portrayed the pointed-eared Spock. They were always referenced to my pointed ears. And here I was portraying a character talking about a character, Vincent Van Gogh, who was very famous, among other things, for having cut off his ear or a piece of his ear. So there were obvious references to the ear stories.
Il est connu pour cet aspect-là, Leonard Nimoy?
Pas du tout. Pas du tout.
Ils l'ont découvert.
Ils l'ont découvert, ouais.
Ouais,
Il est connu bien sûr pour Spock.
Bah ouais, bien sûr.
Et puis pas du tout. C'était sa première pièce en fait. Et ça marchait bien.
Parce que c'était Monsieur Spock, hein, Leonard Nimoy.
J'ai vu la revue de presse.
Ouais.
Mais les Américains, ils aiment beaucoup l'impressionnisme, Van Gogh et tout ça. Parce que quand ils viennent au bureau, ils nous demandent où est-ce qu'habitait Van Gogh.
Oui. Bonjour. Excusez-moi de déranger. Je fais un spectacle sur Vincent Van Gogh à Ciné 13. Et je sais qu'il habitait ici.
Ouais.
Et je voulais savoir dans quel immeuble vous savez.
Dans le tout premier en fait.
Quand Van Gogh arrive à Paris, c'est une révolution. Par rapport à la vie d'avant, c'est comme si tout s'ouvrait pour lui.
Oh, he always wanted to go to Paris. And Theo also asked several times in between for him to come to Paris and to work there and to see more of the modern art that's going on.
C'est une période de grande découverte. Grâce à son frère, il va se trouver au cœur de toute la création contemporaine la plus intéressante. Et pour lui, c'est un véritable coup de fouet, parce qu'au fond, il était un petit peu enterré dans sa palette sombre, dans ses sujets, il tournait en rond, et tout d'un coup, à Paris, il découvre la peinture impressionniste.
Impressionism was the first avant-garde movement, and a group of young rebels fighting against the status quo that was controlled by the French Royal Academy of Fine Arts jettisoned the standard ideals of beauty and aesthetics.
His brother, who was a dealer and who knew these things had to be sold, was constantly telling him to paint with more color, to paint more pleasing subjects, and Vincent refused. And the dominant work in this narrative is The Potato Eater, which Vincent considered to be his masterpiece, and he worked on for months and months at a time. From Theo's perspective and from that of other people in the commercial art world, it was this dark, drab painting of these peasants sitting around a table, somewhat awkwardly painted. There was no audience for that. They wanted pleasant subjects, pleasantly depicted, and Van Gogh wasn't doing that. He just didn't like the idea of it because he was so completely embedded in the work of Joseph Israels and Millet and the other painters of peasant life. But he gets to Paris and he actually sees the paintings and he was bowled over by it.
And he came into the bohemian life, you might say. Paris was, of course, also the bohemian capital of the world at the time. And he enjoyed it. I mean,
it must have been crazy. I mean, Toulouse-Lautrec was a party animal. All those guys were party animals. They were just drank during the day and painted and talk.
It was a dream come true to move in with Theo. He thought of Theo quite rightly as his only soulmate. So Theo really had not invited him to come. He just sort of showed up at the train station and sent a note to Theo's gallery saying, "I'm here." And Theo decided to make it the best of it.
He stayed with me here in Paris for a while. I must say, his visit wore me out. I think I should have become quite ill if he'd stayed any longer.
He had a job at an art gallery. He had to get up early in the morning and came back late in the evening. And he was annoyed when in the evening there was this enormous discussion, and Vincent would always discuss, and so he was not one of the easiest men in that sense to live with.
Hey, old man, you've been a dealer in art for quite some time now. Have you ever considered taking up the brush yourself? I said, no, thank you, my dear brother. I have this nagging habit which prevents me. He said, what nagging habit? I said, eating regularly. He finally convinced me. He convinced me I should try. How could I shirk my responsibility? How could I deny my talent to the world? Well, the next thing I knew, Vincent had furnished me with paints, canvas, easel, brushes, and a lot of enthusiasm. He was like a frantic mother hen standing over my shoulder, offering advice. Perspective, oh boy.
La perspective. Profondeur. Équilibre la composition. Sois énergique. Et il m'arrachait le pinceau des mains et il l'agitait furieusement sur la toile.
A line here, some shading there, some color, balance, composition, forceful. There! Now you've got it, old man!
Theo was convinced that his brother was a great artist. He said, I'm convinced that someday my brother will be to painting what Beethoven is to music. He was an educated art salesman, art dealer, and he had an eye. And he was, not only did he care deeply about his brother emotionally, but he admired his brother's work greatly, really believed in it.
While he was with me, there were some great times. Wonderful, wonderful evenings of conversation. He met so many artists whose work he admired. He met Pissarro, Seurat, Toulouse-Lautrec, Bernard, Gauguin, and they would talk for hours and hours about everything, about their problems, about their work, about art dealers.
The history of their lives tells us that Theo was not a terribly successful dealer. He struggled. He didn't have his own gallery. He worked in other people's galleries as a salesman, and he struggled to make a living. He had a wife and child, and at the end, it is believed that one of the things that led Vincent to such great despair that he killed himself was the fact that he was such a drain on Theo's family.
Moi je fais un spectacle sur Vincent Van Gogh, là, c'est des fraises, en haut de la rue.
D'accord, ok, super. Ouais, je vais regarder. Ok, super, bah merci.
Merci, bonne journée.
Bonne journée.
Je suis le patriarche du game. Médaille d'or comme Hussein. Ça charbonne même les week-ends. Je suis prêt à défourailler sur scène. T'aimes bien, je suis pas une victime du game. T'aimes bien. Ma fierté est africaine. T'aimes bien. Barack m'a dit yes week-end. T'aimes bien. Zig de combattant comme T-Kane. T'aimes bien. J'ai le flow à flow donc tu loses. Avoue que c'est frappé lourd. J'enchaîne les classes et pourquoi tu loues.
Donc moi je suis né en banlieue parisienne, en Seine-Saint-Denis, dans le 9-3 comme on dit, et voilà, je viens moi d'une famille d'artisans beaucoup et avec quelques artistes aussi. Mais sinon presque tout le monde est artisan, ma mère elle peignait aussi, et ma grand-mère aussi. Bon, en fait ce qui s'est passé c'est que dans la fin des années 80, juste là au bout de ma rue, il y avait des usines. Et je suis parti là-bas avec un photographe. Et après, j'ai été peindre là-bas. Et je me suis rendu compte, je suis resté 5 ans dans ces usines, j'ai peint, j'ai rencontré beaucoup d'amis, de graffeurs de l'époque qui sont encore des amis 25 ans après. Et un jour, quand elles ont été démolies, les usines, au bout de 5 ans, j'ai trouvé le tableau qui s'appelle les usines de Clichy et de Saint-Ouen de Van Gogh. Et donc j'ai étudié où il avait peint le tableau, j'ai compris que c'était au même endroit les usines, à Clichy, à Saint-Ouen, là où moi j'habitais et je travaillais aussi. Et je me suis rendu compte que c'était 100 ans avant. Que 100 ans avant, Van Gogh avait peint les usines de Clichy au début de l'industrialisation, et 100 ans après, moi, j'étais venu dedans, peindre dans les usines, sur les murs, à la fin de l'industrialisation.
Il a peint 30 tableaux, à peu près 30 tableaux ici, sur les quais de la Seine, entre Clichy, Asnières, Saint-Ouen. Puis là, il y avait un pont avant, qu'il a peint d'ailleurs, avec le chemin de fer, et il a été démoli pendant la guerre aussi. Et là-bas, maintenant, ça s'appelle le port Van Gogh. Quand j'étais jeune, j'ai fait des graffitis aussi, sous les ponts là. Donc il y a 30 ans, je faisais des graffitis sous les ponts là, où Van Gogh peignait. Mais je ne savais pas que Van Gogh avait peint ici, à l'époque.
Voilà, tout à fait. À partir de ce moment-là, j'ai fait des recherches, j'ai commencé à étudier Van Gogh, j'ai commencé à aller partout où Van Gogh est passé. Partout où Van Gogh est passé vivre, exposer, travailler, j'y suis allé depuis 20 ans. Partout. Des fois, j'ai planté des fleurs, des fois, j'ai peint des portraits, des fois, j'ai collé des portraits. Des fois, j'ai fait des performances avec d'autres artistes, mais partout où Van Gogh est passé, je suis allé.
Ça c'est un tableau de Van Gogh, le pont d'Anières. Moi, quand j'étais jeune, j'allais taguer là-bas. Je faisais des graffitis là-bas sous le pont. Le tableau, il est fait qu'avec des mots, des tags et des bouts de graffiti. Il n'y a que ça. Il y a tout et des mots. Tout, c'est des mots. Arbre, olivier, blé, Saint-Rémy, Love, Van Gogh. Ça, c'est la peinture en bronze, hein, comme il s'appelle. Il appelle ça en bronze, lui. Ça, c'est Van Gogh jeune, ça. Van Gogh quand il avait 13 ans, je crois.
Et ce qu'il y a d'intéressant, pour moi, avec le street art, c'est que c'est la suite de l'impressionnisme. C'est-à-dire que les impressionnistes sont les premiers artistes à descendre, peindre dans la rue, et dans la nature, grâce à l'invention du tube de peinture. Qu'ils ont pu aller peindre sur le motif, et nous, les graffeurs, grâce à la bombe de peinture, on a pu peindre sur les murs. Et dans la rue aussi. Donc s'il n'y avait pas eu les impressionnistes, il n'y aurait pas eu le graffiti. Je me sens proche de Van Gogh à plein de niveaux, parce que je trouve qu'il était, était total. Total dans sa peinture, total dans sa façon d'être. Comme on dit, quand il était pasteur, il allait dans les mines pour prêcher pour les pauvres. Voilà, moi j'ai lu beaucoup sur Van Gogh, j'ai beaucoup étudié, aussi bien ses lettres que des livres sur lui. Et je me trouve des points communs avec lui. Mon objectif, c'était pas la réussite ou l'argent. Je m'en foutais. Mon objectif, c'était l'art. Devenir un artiste, rencontrer des artistes, faire des choses, évoluer, apprendre grâce à la rencontre au travail. Et Van Gogh était comme ça.
Van Gogh left Paris having absorbed so much that his head was spinning, because he'd also absorbed the fast, sometimes decadent lifestyle of the fin de siècle city. He drank too much, especially absinthe. He smoked to the point where he had a smoker's cough, and he was spiritually wounded.
And with Vincent, you might say, when you look at history through his life, that it's always countryside city. So whenever he's too long in the countryside and too isolated, he's longing for a more cultural environment. So he goes to a city, Antwerp, goes to Paris, goes to The Hague. But when he's too long in the city, then that gets on his nerve, because there's too much distraction probably as well. And this time he chose the south of France. But he describes quite nicely that when he's sitting in the train and going to the south of France to Arles, that looking outside, he sees the landscape slowly changing into Japan. Of course, he had no clue what Japan actually looked like, but he's longing for a new place to be, a warmer place to be, which is more good for his health, and where he can perhaps be more happy and less depressed.
Vincent Van Gogh est resté chez nous à Arles 15 mois. Et en 15 mois, il a peint 250 œuvres. Et quand il était en forme, il écrit qu'il pouvait peindre un tableau en 4 heures. Et à Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, 1 an, il va encore en faire 150. Donc toute sa vie, les spécialistes disent plus ou moins 800 œuvres et 400 en Provence.
And when Vincent was in the south of France in Arles, and after he found his own place, the Yellow House, so after a couple of months, first he boarded in small inns. I wasn't very happy with that, but then he found a place to stay and a place to have a studio, and in the end hoped to make it his own home, and which is always referred to the Yellow House because it was painted yellow. And he wanted to start something as not exactly a colony, but he wanted to say some kind of working together of artists in the south of France. And one of the first artists he immediately had in mind to come to the south was Paul Gauguin.
Monsieur Paul Gauguin. Ah, j'aurais aimé qu'il ne rencontre jamais Gauguin. C'était le début de la fin. Vincent a déménagé dans le sud, en Arles.
Gauguin was in bad times. With a reputation as an artist, yes, but no money, no support. Well, for Vincent, that was perfect. He'd found another soul to save.
Gauguin, it turns out, was not such a terrific guy. Gauguin left his family, deserted his wife and children, left them penniless because he decided he didn't want to be a responsible family man working in a bank anymore. He wanted to paint. So he simply left them. He was gone. And eventually took off for Tahiti, where he died, where he did some of his greatest work. And he became a great artist. but they were acquaintances, and Vincent admired Gauguin's work or his efforts. And when Vincent found a house in Arles, he wrote to Theo and said, please get Gauguin to come here. I'd like to start a community of artists in Arles, and I'd like to begin with Gauguin.
He hoped that the Yellow House would become a meeting ground for artists, but it was a pipe dream. Even the one person who came to live with him, Gauguin, was paid to come. Theo paid him 150 francs a month to move in with his brother. His one attempt at an artist colony, like his one attempt at a romance, was paid for by Theo.
And then he came. Gauguin arrived. I sent him the money, and he arrived. And for Vincent, the ground shook when Gauguin walked. Why? God, why? Why did he admire him so? Yes, he's a fine artist, but Vincent was doing beautiful work himself. When Gauguin saw fit to tell Vincent that his work was good, no, he couldn't accept that. Too much praise from such a giant, he said.
Il fait un portrait de moi. Gauguin fait un portrait de moi. Gauguin est bon, Gauguin est un sage, Gauguin est génial. Gauguin est un salaud.
The pompous, sarcastic, self-righteous bore. They began to argue violently. And of course, Gauguin threatened to leave. Well, he certainly knew how to do that, didn't he? He'd already deserted his wife and 5 children, left them without a penny.
They work together on and on, but they also discuss art and things like that, and things go wrong. I mean, in the sense that their two characters are very, very different.
Gauguin saw painting in a different way, a painting from imagination, from memory. Vincent didn't see it that way. He wanted to be there in front of nature and paint it. So he tried to be open-minded about Gauguin's way of seeing art.
And Vincent tried to paint Gauguin's way de tête a couple of times, and they were completely unsuccessful.
Mais Vincent se sentait seul, terriblement seul, et ne se portait pas très bien lui-même. Il travaillait dur. Il peignait avec frénésie. Et toujours il souffrait de solitude.
And something snaps with Vincent. Vincent's probably more or less realizing that this is not going to work the way he saw it. And he, as I said, Vincent can sometimes, if he has something in his head the way it should be like that. And you can discuss with him, but probably he has to be right in the end.
Vincent was exhausted. He was terrified of being left alone again. And Gauguin's a clever man. He knew exactly how to drive Vincent right to the edge. Night after night, arguments, terrible arguments.
The most tragic fight ended in Van Gogh cutting his ear. Now, we will never know the truth of that event.
It was set off by a number of things, principally by the fact that Gauguin was leaving, and he just couldn't handle the fact that Gauguin, after one attempted departure, had made the decision to leave, and all of a sudden he would be utterly alone again.
Un soir, c'est Gauguin qui raconte, il a vu Van Gogh derrière lui, dans la rue, avec une lame de rasoir dans la main. Donc il a eu peur.
Et Gauguin se pavanait dans la rue comme un matador, laissant Vincent derrière tel un taureau blessé. Vincent le pourchassa avec une lame de rasoir. Gauguin n'en put pas, s'arrêta, fit demi-tour et se toisèrent dans l'obscurité. Et bien sûr, Vincent ne pouvait pas faire de mal à Gauguin. Il ne pouvait pas attaquer son Dieu sur terre.
First, Gauguin claims that he came after him with a razor and said, you're not supposed to leave, and things like that. And then he went back to his own yellow house, and Gauguin thought it more safe to sleep that night in a hotel because he was afraid of Vincent, that he might do something to him.
Alors il revint dans sa chambre et retourna la lame contre lui. Oui, je suis sûr que vous l'avez déjà entendu parler. Se coupa l'oreille, enfin une partie. Il l'a enveloppé dans un drap qu'il a attaché avec un ruban.
And carried it to the local brothel. There was a prostitute there named Rachel. She enjoyed mocking her customers like a parrot.
5 francs ou coupez-vous l'oreille. 5 francs ou coupez-vous l'oreille.
Alors là, après, nous savons que Rachel a ouvert, évidemment. Quand elle a vu le bout d'oreille, elle a dû appeler la patronne, qui a appelé les gendarmes. Et à 5 heures du matin, Vincent était inconscient parce qu'il avait perdu beaucoup de sang. Il a été transporté dans l'hôpital.
Theo came over immediately, Vincent saw no need for him to stay, so I also left the same evening. And afterwards, Vincent never referred to this anymore. We had no memory of it. He says sometimes in his letters that he all of a sudden simply fell down in the street and then woke up again and just went back and didn't know exactly what was happening. Probably was already signs of what was his sickness, his illness, but we don't exactly know what it was.
I write to you in full possession of my faculties, and not as a madman, but as the brother you know. This is the truth. A certain number of people here, there were more than 80 signatures, addressed a petition to the mayor describing me as a man not fit to be at liberty, or something like that. The commissioner of police then gave the order to shut me up for the good of the community. Anyhow, here I am, shut up in a cell under lock and key and with keepers, without my guilt being proved or even open to proof. If I did not have your friendship, I should be driven to suicide. And cowardly as I am, I should commit it in the end. If the police had protected my liberty by preventing the children and even the grown-ups from crowding around my house and climbing the windows as they have done, as if I were a curious animal, I should have more easily retained my self-possession.
He basically was removed from Arles, meaning the citizens of Arles signed a petition to have him ejected from the town. And he finally just sort of gave up and decided to accept the idea of moving into this facility in this religious run asylum in Saint-Remy.
Well, already in Arles, when he was committed in the hospital, there was a doctor there who said he had epilepsy. Then he went to Saint-Remy. The doctor there confirmed it.
Epilepsy. Yes, epilepsy. That's what the doctors told me. I have their reports. From Dr. Ray, his physician at Arles, epileptic crisis. From Dr. Perron, chief surgeon of the asylum at Saint-Remy, attack of epilepsy. Seizures. Had a number of seizures. When the attacks came, they terrified him. They'd terrify anyone. The man was drained, physically, emotionally drained. And the attacks were nightmares, voices, visions, hallucinations. When they came, he didn't know what he was doing. One time, he was found eating his own paints. Another time, he drank the kerosene from the lamps. One day, he was allowed to go into the fields alone to paint. He didn't come back. When they found him, he was clinging desperately to a tree. He screamed when they tried to tear him away. He believed that tree had captured his soul. If he left it, he was going to die.
There have been more than 30 psychological speculations about Van Gogh's health. They range from schizophrenia to bipolar disorder to epilepsy to one that we know was a component, which is that he was poisoning himself from the pigments that he was using.
He became sort of the iconic representation of the mad artist, the artist whose work comes out of his craziness, which was really unfair. He was a very, very hardworking, very learned painter by the time he was finished with his work.
His initial experiences there were, by his account, quite positive, meaning that all of a sudden he wasn't lonely. All of a sudden he was surrounded by other patients and he wasn't on his own. And for a short period of time, he actually was calmed and almost happy.
I mean, he was struggling with turmoil, but when he was in those periods of peace, that's when he made those masterpieces, you know, away from the constant turmoil in his head.
Malgré cela, les gens d'ici se connaissent très bien et s'aident les uns les autres quand ils tombent dans des crises. Quand je travaille dans le jardin, ils viennent tous voir. Et je t'assure, ils sont plus discrets et plus polis que, par exemple, les bons citoyens de la ville d'Arles. Et maintenant, tout son être, tout ce qu'il éprouvait, la beauté, la passion, la force, son amour pour la nature, l'humanité, tout fusionné dans la splendeur de son travail. Son talent, sa technique, sa maîtrise étaient si aboutis qu'il pouvait produire 2 magnifiques toiles en une journée. Il commençait à peindre au lever du soleil. Il peignait furieusement jusqu'à midi, finissait une toile, mangeait un morceau de pain, tournait son chevalet dans une autre direction et il recommençait.
Et puis progressivement, il va mieux, donc il peut sortir. Et là, il est dans la nature, donc il va observer les champs de blé, il va observer les alpilles. Il est très proche de la nature. Et le champ de blé prend à ce moment-là aussi une dimension biblique.
He created some of his most astonishing works while being treated for sanity. Van Gogh painted Starry Night, surely his most popular painting, in the asylum, when he was in the asylum. And many viewers look at that painting and think that he was hallucinating, that he was crazy, that it was an insane response to a nighttime sky.
C'est une scène de nocturne, donc on est nulle part aussi, il n'y a vraiment pas de limite. On pourrait être partout, on pourrait être à Amsterdam, on pourrait vraiment... on est dans l'univers, on est dans le cosmos, et au fond, on n'est rien du tout.
The myth that was that people have in mind is that Van Gogh would paint very fast because it was all impulse and he didn't think about things. But no, the fact is he would analyze, think for days before even putting the brush on the painting, on the canvas, and then it would be very fast. He would tell his brother Theo, he would say, please don't tell people how fast I paint, because they would think it's worthless.
You would think that he was traipsing around freely in order to make these paintings. Most of them, that he always had to have an attendant go with him, and most of these sites are actually right there near the hospital. The wheat field is right outside the side of his window. The olive groves are right in front of the institution. It was in the days before he left the facility that he painted the irises and the roses. So here he is in this monstrous, insane asylum, painting these incredibly joyous, glorious masterpieces of flowers. I mean, his ability to transmute misery into joy and into great art is astonishing.
Through the iron-barred window of my room, I see a square field of wheat in an enclosure, a perspective above which I see the morning sun rising in all its glory.
This Vincent Van Gogh was so deeply passionate about the idea of having a positive effect on people's lives through his art. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to move people. He wanted to touch people with art, with beauty, the beauty of the art. And to go through this struggle for so many years of rejection, and then to reach this low point in his life where, having in his illness, whatever one calls it, whether it was the psychological or physical, whatever it was, cuts himself, mutilates himself that way, is hospitalized, comes back out of the hospital and goes to this place where he lives in the center of the town of Arles, and people are throwing garbage at his windows. The local populace are throwing garbage at his windows and calling him madman. It's a powerfully tragic story to me of these extremes of wanting so desperately to be a positive influence on people's lives and to find himself being treated as a pariah, outcast. Go away, we don't want you around us. We want you locked up.
C'est le premier artiste qu'on a qualifié d'artiste maudit dans l'histoire de l'art. Bah, maudit, ça veut dire qu'il est maudit, quoi, comme si Dieu est contre lui, comme si tout contre lui, qu'il ne gagnera pas d'argent, qu'il est né pour être dans la misère, machin. Donc je pense qu'il y a tout ce mythe aussi. Le fait qu'il se soit suicidé, son histoire avec son frère, toutes les lettres qu'il a écrites aussi, ça permet de connaître le personnage. Que moi avant j'étais plus fan de Picasso, tout ça. J'ai beaucoup, hein. Van Gogh c'est pas forcément mon peintre préféré, c'est vraiment quelqu'un pour qui j'ai un respect. C'est comme si c'était ma famille presque maintenant. C'est marrant, hein, comme si c'était de ma famille Van Gogh presque.
Vincent goes to Auvers-sur-Oise in May 1890. He will only live there for just over 2 months before he kills himself. And of course, he didn't know when he came there that it was going to be that short. But Auvers-sur-Oise came handy because he wanted to go back to the north. That's one of the wishes he had, because he didn't like to stay in the asylum in Saint-Rémy.
The way Van Gogh got to Auvers was through Theo and the painter Pissarro. Theo was Pissarro's dealer. So Theo at first asked Pissarro if he'd be willing to have Vincent come and live with him in his house and for Pissarro to more or less supervise him. And Pissarro had small children and was not at all happy with this idea. So he thought of his friend, the doctor, Paul Gachet, who practiced in Paris but had a house in Auvers and who had a keen interest in issues of mental health. So it seemed like a really good match.
Gachet, Van Gogh felt, had a sympathetic soul and would not only be a good companion, but could possibly heal him.
Dr. Gachet didn't have a lot of options. He intended to treat Vincent, if you can call it treatment, homeopathically. He brewed his own homeopathic remedies. But above all, he felt that an environment with less stimulation and more regulation and more kindness, I think, and more individual attention would allow Vincent to stabilize for his cycle of extreme moods.
And then, at last, one day, one joyous, miraculous, incredible day just 4.5 months ago, we sold one of his paintings. It was The Red Vines. It sold in Brussels for 400 francs. His first sale. I wrote to him and I said, Vincent, we're almost at the top of the hill. You and I are like a pair of horses in harness. And we're almost at the top of the hill. It's time to celebrate.
Je voudrais volontiers t'écrire sur bien des choses, mais j'en sens l'inutilité. Il y a ceci que toujours je t'ai dit, je te le redis encore, que je considérerai toujours que tu es autre chose qu'un simple marchand de coraux. Que par mon intermédiaire, tu as ta part à la production même de mes toiles.
It should have been a beginning. His first sale should have been a beginning. He was living at Auvers. He had a room over the Café Ravoux. He was under the care of Dr. Gachet, a good, kind man with an interest in art. He had a beautiful place to work. He had his wheat fields, cornfields, sunflowers. He had someone to care for him. He was getting recognition, and he had sold. It should have been a beginning.
My dear mother and sister, I am feeling much calmer, and the restlessness in my head has greatly quieted down. I often think of you both, and should very much like to see you once again. I'm quite absorbed in the immense plain with wheat fields against the hills, boundless as a sea, delicate yellow, delicate soft green, the delicate violet of a dug-up and weeded piece of soil, everything under a sky of delicate blue, white, pink, and violet tones. I'm in a mood of almost too much calmness to paint this.
When he died, Theo found on his body, in his pocket, he found a draft, part of a draft of the last letter that Vincent wrote. And the draft of that letter is slightly different from the letter that Vincent in the end sent to Theo. And it is some kind of an explanation of how he looked at his brother, that he always saw him as a real man, and someone who dealt in pictures, not in man, things like that. And there was something else, and I'm just making this work and nobody wants it, and but what can you do? And it is as if it's not actually a farewell letter, but it is something that probably Vincent stuck with him in his pocket because he wanted Theo to find it.
It was wonderful to be there, I mean, they recreated the place, the way it was set up and the way it was, you can breathe the time, you can breathe I can't imagine what Vincent went through, and I was not even trying to. I was just trying to realize what Theo must have gone through.
La semaine dernière, j'ai reçu un télégramme du docteur Gachet me disant que mon frère s'était blessé gravement et que je devais venir au plus vite. Quand je suis arrivé, Vincent était assis sur son lit, fumant tranquillement sa pipe. Son visage était pâle, mais calme. Dimanche matin, comme à son habitude, juste avant midi, il était parti dans les champs de maïs, à l'orée de la ville, en portant son chevalet et un pistolet. Il s'est tiré une balle dans la poitrine. Il a dû rester là toute la journée sous le soleil brûlant, car ce n'est que très longtemps après le dîner qu'il rentrait dans le café, montait les escaliers en titubant et s'effondrait sur son lit. Je me suis assis à son chevet, j'ai pris ses mains dans les miennes. Il m'a regardé avec ses yeux bleus innocents. Il était comme un jeune petit garçon. Il avait cassé un de mes jouets et il en était très très désolé. Il m'a demandé pardon de m'avoir coûté tant d'argent toutes ces années. Il était surpris d'être encore en vie. Il m'a dit: Théo, j'ai raté tant de choses dans ma vie. J'espère que je n'ai pas aussi raté cela. Le docteur Gachet lui a dit: Vincent, vous avez une constitution robuste, la blessure n'est pas grave, vos chances de guérison sont bonnes. Mais Vincent n'en avait que faire. Cet entêté n'en avait que faire. Il était résolu à réussir sa propre mort. Nous avons parlé une bonne partie de la nuit, de notre enfance dans le Brabant, des champs de blé, des vergers, de cette vieille grange en pierre. Tard dans la nuit, j'ai senti ses mains se relâcher et sa voix s'affaiblir. Je me suis assis sur son lit et je l'ai bercé dans mes bras. J'ai embrassé son visage. Il m'a regardé et il a dit: Théo, j'aimerais pouvoir mourir comme ça. Et il a fermé les yeux et j'ai senti son cœur s'arrêter. Je le serrais très fort, je ne voulais pas le laisser partir. J'ai senti son arme s'attarder autour de moi pendant quelques instants. Puis quelque chose s'est détaché de moi. Et il est parti.
One of the reasons for Vincent not to spend his last moments dealing with the police and a police investigation is that Theo arrived by his bedside and they spent several reasonably coherent hours in each other's company. Vincent was in too much pain to have much conversation, but he at least had the comfort of knowing that Theo was there by his side as he was dying. So it's an incredibly touching scene that after this very complicated life together, in which Theo was his only emotional support and his financial support, that Theo was by his bedside when he died.
On the morning that Van Gogh shot himself, he went out as usual to paint. He went up onto the plateau where the wheat grows and took his easel and his paints with him and
began to paint, or at least so we believe, because we don't really know.
There were a lot of things about the death that seemed mysterious to us. One of them was the chronology of the day. The idea that someone would kill themselves in the afternoon after going out in the morning to go painting just seemed like an odd thing to do. Even though that Vincent was miserable, he was less miserable in Auvers than he had been at earlier times in his life. It seemed really odd to us that somebody would give him a gun. Why would they give him a gun? What purpose would there be to give him a gun? Why would you give this person who just come out of an insane asylum a gun? There weren't that many guns in Auvers.
He grew up very religious, very much a faith-filled family, and of course, the Christian religion forbids suicide. That's really an important issue. And yet, if you are as desperately filled with anguish as he was, and if you think a lot about death, I personally find it hard to believe that you would not, from time to time, consider suicide.
It was widely assumed, and it was incorporated into the Lust for Life film, that Vincent was painting the crows in the wheat field as his last painting. And that painting can be seen as a rumination on death, because there are these two pathways and these crows descend menacingly on the fields. And it was suggested by some scholars that the reason he had the gun was to shoot the crows. Well, he was a bird lover from childhood. He collected birds' nests and birds' eggs, and the idea that he was threatened by crows was a little ludicrous. And then you find out that there were no crows in Auvers in the month he died anyway. This was the wrong season for crows.
More recently, a man has come out, a man named Secretan, and admitted that he was among a group of hooligans who tormented Van Gogh throughout his late life, yelling at him, calling him Le Fourreux, the crazy redhead, and making his life miserable.
He admitted in this sort of interview not long before he died, that he and his brother tormented Vincent as bullies had throughout his life.
Secretan says that the day Van Gogh was shot, the hooligans were out in the countryside and shooting guns off. And his belief is that one of those shots accidentally killed Van Gogh.
The scene that one imagines would have been them drunk. They were near one of their drinking spots. They're playing, the guy's in a cowboy outfit. Vincent's presumably had too much to drink too. They're tussling and the gun goes off.
So he staggers back to the inn at the end of the day, clutching his side and in great pain. And no one knows what happened in between. And most interestingly and most mysterious, the gun was never found, and neither was any of his painting equipment. So that, I think, is a really good point for the case that he may not have committed suicide, because somebody went up there and tidied up.
Part of the Van Gogh mythology, in some ways, to have accepted this accidental homicide as a way out, rather than killing himself, is, to our mind, a much nobler and in some ways more tragic end than mere suicide.
À 3h de l'après-midi, nous avons emmené Vincent au cimetière, dans un très joli coin bordé par un vieux mur de pierre près d'un champ de maïs. Et maintenant, il est loin, nous attendant tranquillement. Avec sa disparition, pour moi, l'air s'est vidé de son oxygène.
Vincent used to say, we take a train to reach a city. We take death to reach a star. There are no words to express the sense of loss.
C'est une tristesse sans réconfort, une tristesse qui ne me quittera pas aussi longtemps que je vivrai. Je ne suis pas seul dans mon tourment. Beaucoup de ses fidèles amis partagent ma douleur.
I would say probably a select group of men who came to appreciate him, to talk about him, and to accompany the casket up to the cemetery on the hillside where he and Theo are now side by side.
Au cimetière, quand son corps est retourné à la terre, tous ses amis se sont réunis pour une dernière fois. Même Toulouse-Lautrec, qui lui-même venait d'être relâché de l'asile à Neuilly-sur-Seine. Ils étaient tous là, les artistes, les mendiants, les paysans. Les mendiants Il savait et il reconnaissait son génie et son talent unique.
They knew of his genius and how special he was, but I wanted to tell them something about my brother, so they would know him like I knew him. They had to know what he stood for, what he believed in. And again, I couldn't do it. I couldn't speak. And then the moment was gone, and it was too late.
Theo died, 6 months after Vincent passed away of syphilis complications, and he just lost it.
It is hard to know, but it certainly seems that the trauma of Vincent's death triggered some levels of insanity in Theo. He was clearly falling apart, but not to the extent that he did within months after Vincent died, so that his wife had to have him admitted to a psychiatric facility in Paris. It's really terribly sad that this elegant, innovative dealer who showed, one of the first to show the Impressionist work, without whom Vincent's career wouldn't have happened. If it weren't for Theo, we wouldn't have Vincent.
Won't you ever learn? Love the poor, Vincent. Love the lost, the outcasts, the destitute, the homeless. Even love a bastard like Gauguin. But for God's sake, Vincent, won't you ever learn to love yourself?
Leonard Nimoy, the actor best known for his well-loved Star Trek character Mr. Spock, has died at age 83. The actor died this morning, Friday the 27th of February, at his home in the Bel Air section of Los Angeles. His wife Susan Bay Nimoy confirmed his death, saying the cause was end-stage chronic obstructive pulmonary disease.
A friend of mine texted me from DC. He said, have you heard the news about Nimoy? And I said, well, he passed away. It took me a while to took me like a day or two to get my stuff together and say, okay, well, he's there, performing his play.
Jean-Michel and Leonard became very good friends, and Leonard did everything he could to introduce Jean-Michel to theaters all around the United States. And that's because his performance, his adaptation of the play, deserved to have an enduring shelf life.
Cher Théo, je t'écris en pleine possession de ma présence d'esprit, et non pas comme un fou, mais en frère que tu connais. Voici la vérité. Un certain nombre de gens d'ici, il y avait peut-être 80 signatures, ont adressé une pétition au maire me désignant comme un homme indigne de vivre en liberté ou quelque chose comme ça. Le commissaire de police a alors donné l'ordre de m'emprisonner pour préserver l'ordre public. Toutefois, il que me voici de longs jours enfermé sous clé et verrou au cabanon, sans que ma culpabilité soit prouvée ou même prouvable. La semaine dernière, lorsqu'on a enterré mon frère.
He discovered the play in a very unique and powerful way. very different from Leonard's portrayal. Leonard's portrayal of Theo had a lot more anger in it. He was pained, but he was frustrated. Jean-Michel came from a loving place of his brother, and he was willing to make the sacrifices.
Maintenant, ça y est, j'ai tout dit. Et je vous remercie. Merci. Peut-être que je pourrais trouver un peu de paix. Mon seul souhait est que Vincent ait enfin trouvé le repos qu'il recherchait tellement. La vie lui pesait tant. Comme d'habitude, tout le monde louera désormais son talent. Ah, mes amis, c'était mon frère à moi. It's always emotional to perform that play, but having Leonard gone, it was more about him now than about Van Gogh. Many times on stage, I felt it's about Leonard. And then we put this we put his photo, and then that really got to me a few times. But it was about Leonard.
I think that Leonard saw in Van Gogh a man looking for love, and that was Leonard's journey too, I think. The idea that Van Gogh struggled was something Leonard could identify with.
The happiest moment in Vincent's life was a visit by Theo to The Hague when the two of them took a day-long walk. It says everything about this life, that day with Theo, when they were getting along and they weren't fighting, and Vincent felt a strong fraternal bond with Theo, was the high point of his entire existence on the face of the earth.
He was a rebel. I think a lot of artists feel close to his way of striving to get to the truth of things.
To be surrounded by his work and see the depth and range of not only his skill, but the passion that fills that skill is overwhelming.
Van Gogh, c'était pas un impressionniste, ce n'était pas un post-impressionniste, ce n'était pas un expressionniste, c'était un artiste.